Tonight, politics, election reform, and the remarkable election of 2000. It was so remarkable, in fact, that we decided not to let the late-night comedians have all the fun. So don't be surprised if tonight's show feels a little more like Saturday Night Live than Face the Nation. And don't be surprised if the next hour is a little more humorous than the usual PBS documentary, because you just can't make this stuff up.
Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep or social claims. The fact is the sheep have been counted and recounted, some cases counted 3 and 4 times, and the results have been certified in accordance with Florida state law. Let's get on with it.
This program is made possible with support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the following.
I can certainly do that. I can also put silly putty on a comic and lift it off and get junk in it.
Hi, I'm Frank Sesno. Those final days of the 2000 presidential election were so bizarre, with so many twists and turns, you had to find the humor in them. Well, we've since moved on. But if you ask the thousands of people in Florida who encountered familiar problems trying to vote in the 2002 Democratic primary, they just might say we've moved on too quickly. So tonight, we're going to look again, to try to figure out what we've learned, what we've done since, and how we can fix those things that went so terribly wrong.
It will be a long and exciting evening before we know who is the next president of the United States.
George Bush has got to win Ohio. He has got to win Tennessee and Arkansas. He has got to win Missouri.
How does Al Gore get to 269, 270?
Without Pennsylvania, he would have to win Missouri and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa, 2 states that are now too close to call.
It was always a close race. I offered to help campaign for him. I actually said, let me help out with Florida, sort of mass market the human touch, press the flesh. I was going to be there for spring break anyway.
This is WJKR in Jacksonville, Florida.
Polls are now officially open.
Good morning, Jacksonville. It's election day. Time to wake up and vote.
On election day, it's always so exciting for me, and I want to be the first one at my particular precinct.
Florida has 67 different counties and almost as many ways of conducting elections. And it seems that voters in just about every county had a story to tell.
They indicated to me, well, sorry, you can't vote. And I said, what do you mean? I cannot vote. I'm a member of the United States Congress, and I'm going to vote for myself. I said, listen, call downtown and verify that, I have not voted so I can vote. And I was able to vote. But how many people will just be very persistent about voting?
I was the clerk of this particular unit at the Palm Beach County Water Utilities. The clerk is the one who makes sure everything is set to go for the election. I came the day before to make sure everything is set up and they know exactly what's happening. The polls open at 7, that was no problem. They close at 7. Around 6 o'clock, I noticed nobody's coming in. That's kind of funny because we have workers, even though this is mostly retired people, they're workers that come here. And I sent my deputy down who's outside, and he says the gates were closed, nobody can come in. They're on a timer, so that I would say we lost about 45 minutes of people coming in to vote. The whole day was a complete disaster.
Getting into the voting booth was one problem, but once you got in there, well...
I went in at 7:30 in the morning to vote, and when I saw the ballot, I said out loud, oh,
And about 12:30, I got a phone call from my sister who lives in Del Rey, and she was telling me about the ballot. I said, I had no problem. First it said Bush, and then it said Gore. I voted for the second one, Gore. She says, no, you voted for Buchanan. Well, I got sick.
The
The instructions in number 3 said punch to the right of the candidate. You could only punch to the left of the candidate if you voted for Buchanan, so it was illegal.
I didn't go in there to take a test. I went in there to vote for the President of the United States.
I didn't have any problem with the butterfly ballot. I always read everything over, follow the directions.
You take it, you put the little pin down, you go across the name, you punch your hole.
This particular election was a big election. I felt like it was critical. So I made sure, look at the names, make sure and check before I walk away from the ballot box.
It took me a good 5 minutes inside the voting booth, and I know exactly who I wanted to vote for. And I couldn't make head or tails of this machine.
You see, the whole machine jiggles when it's attached to the machine. And here you see the second one down is to Pat Buchanan. This is the first time that one of these machines ever had all the presidential candidates on two sides, because as you can see from the rest of the butterfly, there's nothing on the right side. So if you were a normal voter who have ever used this machine before, you didn't bother to look over here. The arrows pointed above the hole, to the side of the hole. In some of these machines, the alignment was much worse.
Maybe they need to read a little more. Maybe they need to follow directions. Maybe they need to take their glasses with them. If they can, pass the driver's license, which is about on the 3rd or 4th grade level in Florida.
I have 2 master's degrees. Imagine people who had less formal education.
I don't doubt the number of those ballots that those votes were cast for me probably were intended for Vice President Gore.
Oh, it was horrible. I was beside myself. I mean, we heard reports of this kind of thing happening, and it wasn't just elderly Jewish voters in Palm Beach County that made mistakes on their ballots. There were people from all walks of life that had trouble, doctors, lawyers. I know a young woman who was a professional dancer at the Gold Club who couldn't figure out the ballot, and she even has a tattoo of a butterfly on her bikini line.
By many accounts, the poor design of the butterfly ballot resulted in nearly 20,000 Palm Beach County votes being discarded. But the butterfly ballot wasn't the only kind of ballot design that caused confusion.
A copy of the ballot.
This was called the caterpillar.
If you will look in the first column of the ballot, it says electors for president and vice president. Down that first column, you have George Bush name, Al Gore, and several others. So the layout of the ballot, if you were voting for president, you would think that was in the first column. And the second column has general election. So the people thought that this was a different election.
But of course, it wasn't a different election. It was a continuation of the presidential election.
That same ballot was taken by a political scientist to his Rotary Club in Columbus, Ohio, and he was a professor at Ohio State University. And 10% of his Rotary Club did the same thing that the electorate in Gadsden County did. They voted for what candidate in the presidential race, then they hopped over to column 2 and voted for one of those 2 people. That was a local administrative error that had a severe impact on the race.
But wait, that's not all.
And there were some people that wrote in Al Gore's name here.
So a lot of people thought that meant I vote it, and then they're testing to make sure if I really want it, I write it in. Vote for Gore, write him in. That's what it says. It says write in candidate. So that's what they did.
Look, come on. My shampoo bottle says wet, lather, rinse, repeat, but you don't see me spending all day stuck in the shower repeating. The ballot directions are fairly simple, and if you can't read, you can't speak the King's English, perhaps you shouldn't retain the right to vote, although I suppose it shouldn't prevent you from becoming leader of the free world.
This election, we got really hung up on the voting technology equipment. And the fact of the matter is, one of the things we analyzed in ballot error was that the design of the ballot was often even more important than the quality of the equipment. Everybody made a big stink about Palm Beach right after the election that had 6% spoilage. Well, the day after the election, I was looking over the data and I saw Duval County had 12% spoilage. So everybody says, wow, I mean, this is huge. Well, actually, nobody said wow. I said wow, but nobody else did. And I called Duval County and I said, was there anything funny about your ballot? You know, thinking about the butterfly in Palm Beach, and they said no. Well, in fact, there was something terribly defective in the Duval County ballot in that to accommodate the 10 presidential names, they had spread them over 2 pages of the ballot, and the instructions say vote every page. So by following the instructions, you would invalidate your vote.
Dan Keating also investigated the causes of widespread errors in minority communities.
We saw huge spikes where the African American precincts had much higher ballot spoilage. There are many precincts with more than 1 out of 5. So what the NAACP learned is that when you do get out the vote, you also have to do voter education and making sure that voters are trained in how to really record their vote. Because there's some counties, you know, Leon County is famous in Florida for really doing a good job of training the voters and having no voter error.
One study found that in the 2000 election, 4 to 6 million votes were discarded nationwide, many of them due to badly designed ballots. Another major problem, voter turnout. In the last election, only 51% of Americans over the age of 18 even bothered to vote.
One of the things that would help a tremendous amount, in my view, is Election Day registration. There are 6 states that now do that. Those states in the 2000 election had turnouts that were 12% higher than the national average.
If people don't have the gumption to get out and get registered to vote, maybe they don't care enough about the political process and they're not going to go vote. So there is a large segment, politically and in the country, that says we ought to make it hard to vote. You have to, since voting is a duty that you ought to take seriously, we shouldn't make it something easy that a bunch of young kids in their 20s can go do.
So who better to consult than some young people who take this very seriously? Students at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, debating ways to reform our elections.
I'm of the opinion that hopefully the Florida vote will help with apathy. More people will get out and vote because they know that their vote really does count because the election was so close.
I'm a huge proponent of establishing a national holiday for Election Day because I think that the low turnout rate comes a lot from working class, and I think that having a national holiday would definitely facilitate voting among the working class.
Can I disagree? People are going to go on vacation. We're going to get a lower turnout if you have a day off.
Well, what about half a day off? In many countries, actually, Election Day is on Sunday, and that seems to work.
Right now, it works like this. In order to vote in a given election, your name first has to be on a county-wide list called a voter roll. So just register to vote and you're fine, right?
We're a very small county. I have only 1 assistant. I only have 4 precincts that have pavement.
In Florida, as in most states, county election supervisors are responsible for the accuracy of their voter lists.
We were trying to make sure that a person was not registered in another county, that we did not have deceased people on our list, and that we did not have felons on our list.
In most states, felons can't vote while they're in jail, but they get their rights reinstated after they've served their time. Not in Florida, one of about 12 states where felons lose voting rights forever. In fact, in some cases in 2000, you didn't have to be a felon to be treated like one.
There were people that had been voting here for 20 and 30 years. Their names were not on the roll, and they were not felons, and they had never had that problem before.
Florida made an unusual move when it purchased lists of convicted felons from a private Texas corporation and used the lists to pare down its own voter rolls, a procedure that led to numerous errors. In one of the more bizarre twists, Linda Howell herself was listed as a felon.
And sent me a letter at my office saying that I was a convicted felon and that I had the right for an appeal, and what I had to do is have myself fingerprinted.
Florida learned from the experience and adopted a statewide computerized voter list in an effort to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
The person I feel the worst for in all of this, quite frankly, is Jeb Bush, because he couldn't deliver Florida for his brother, and I know that feeling. I mean, I remember my brother for Hanukkah one year wanted Michigan.
Some of Jeb Bush's troubles date back to a year before the election, when he angered many Florida voters by introducing the One Florida program, which eliminated race as a factor in university admissions and state contracts. The NAACP and other groups felt it was an attempt to gut affirmative action, so in response, they started an ambitious voter registration drive, wanting to ensure a large African-American turnout in the 2000 election. Their slogan, "Remember in November."
If my long career as a politician has taught me anything, it's that you really need to watch out when folks start to rhyme. Rhyming is the prime indication of a real threat. And I'm not surprised the Republican Party responded the way they did.
Both parties knew that Florida was going to be a key battleground state. And the NAACP had announced that it was going to make serious efforts to increase minority voting in Florida in election 2000. And one of the responses of the Republican Party was to get a hold of lists of disfranchised felons that they could use to strike these people from the voter rolls. The felon disfranchisement laws were, in a sense, actively used as part of the partisan warfare of election 2000.
The issue of race was highlighted by the fact that a disproportionate number of people who were turned away from the polling places were African American. Analysts say problems with the voter rolls were largely responsible.
There was a pattern of what we think is disenfranchisement and discrimination.
Allegations of vote fraud on the local and state levels prompted the U.S. Civil Rights Commission to launch an immediate investigation. An investigation that Florida officials felt was politically motivated and unfair.
We cannot document whether it was intentional. The label we used to describe what we found was injustice, ineptitude, and inefficiency, up and down the line. I think that many of the problems that existed in Florida and in some of the other states could have been solved if they had had a provisional ballot.
Provisional balloting allows voters who show up at the polling place to cast their vote, even if their name is not on the voter list, and election officials determine later if the vote ought to be counted. Basically, it gives the voters the benefit of the doubt, and for good reason.
Many of our voter lists are absolutely wrong. People registered, they thought they registered, but it wasn't sent in by the sorority house that was doing the voter registration drive or whatever group it was.
If they simply had been able to do as they do in California, which is say, okay, go ahead and vote, we'll put your vote aside, and we'll check it out tomorrow and make sure that this is all okay.
And then there's a check thereafter to determine whether or not you had the right to vote or not. If you did, it gets counted.
That would keep people from being in a position of just not being able to vote.
Florida has instituted a limited version of provisional balloting, which can be crucial in close elections and is considered an important reform. As a result of poor ballot design in Palm Beach and Gadsden counties, faulty instructions in Duval, and inaccurate voter lists throughout the state, the end result was a breakdown of the election mechanics. As many as 180,000 Floridians walked away from the polls without their vote for president being counted correctly or at all.
The system didn't break down for the first time in 2000, and it didn't break down in one state. The system had been breaking down for years, and all across the country.
I think the system worked in a way that the system always works in a democracy as big as ours. You know, elections are sometimes close. People are fallible, including voters. People make errors, some of which they know they're making, some of which they don't know they're making. This is a huge effort that is a great experience in democracy and will never be 100% of what voters intended to do that day.
But this time, because of the closeness of the election, every miscounted or uncounted vote had real impact.
a big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column.
Florida has been prematurely called. First of all, I thought it was a little bit irresponsible of the networks to call it before the polls closed in the western part of Florida.
We're going to hold a moment. This is a videotape of the Bush family back at the governor's mansion. The governor on the phone taking some calls.
He's not conceding anything, and I'm not either in the state of Pennsylvania. Nor are we conceding anything in Florida.
So they just traded off, right? Bush gets Florida, he wins.
We do project that George W. Bush will be the winner by the scantest of margins there in the Sunshine State.
Talk to me, please. Hey, Gore called Bush. He's going to concede in the speech here.
Bush wins. Florida goes Bush. The presidency is Bush. That's it.
The vice president placed a phone call to the Texas governor, congratulated him on winning the election, and in brief remarks here tonight to his supporters and, of course, to the American people, will wish the governor well.
When Al Gore realized that he still had a chance in Florida Tuesday, he called George W. Bush at 3:30 in the morning to withdraw his concession, saying circumstances have changed. Bush replied, "Unbelievable. Let me make sure I understand. You're taking back your concession?" Gore then said, "Well, you don't have to be snippy." To which Bush replied, "Jeb has assured me we have Florida." To which Gore responded, "Let me explain something. Your younger brother is not the ultimate authority on this." To which Bush said, "You conceded. No takebacks, no do-overs."
Hey, hang on, let me call. Put me on. Gore has retracted his concession.
Disbelief.
Just an hour or so ago, the TV networks called this race for Governor Bush. It now appears that their call was premature.
The morning of November 8, 2000 was a day unlike any other in modern political history. The media were still reeling from their own calls and retractions the night before. People from all over the country were still rubbing the sleep from their eyes and then rubbing them again, this time in disbelief.
When I left last night, I thought it was pretty much over. When I got home, I was listening to the news, and I thought it was pretty much over. And then when I woke up this morning, I said to my husband, "Who's the president?" And my husband said, "They don't know yet, and Florida's going to have a recount." I said, "They are?"
Yesterday, the people of our country joined together to make a great national decision to choose the next president of the United States. Despite the fact that Joe Lieberman and I won the popular vote, under our Constitution, it is the winner of the Electoral College who will be the next president.
Ohio, with its 21 electoral votes, went Bush 52%, Gore 45%. Steve, what do you have for us?
Well, John, a candidate needs 270 to put them over the top. Let's go to the map. John, you will notice if a state has gone to Gore, it's been colored in with blue. A Bush state is colored in with red. Currently, you can see the country's a little redder right now. That is good for Bush.
You know, it's a little it's almost like an optical illusion because, quite frankly, Gore is ahead in the Electoral College right now, even though the map visually looks redder.
Country's redder, map don't lie.
80% of Americans think that we should get rid of the Electoral College. What do you think?
I think it's a very antiquated system, and I think that people are reluctant to tamper with it.
Oh, thank God for the Electoral College. Can you imagine what would have happened in the last election if the Electoral College hadn't compartmentalized the problems?
I firmly believe that it's not as strong of a democratic institution as I would like to see, and that it doesn't represent the one person, one vote philosophy.
North and South Dakota, for example, in election 2000, each elector represented roughly 240,000 people. In New York, an elector represented 550,000 people. So that the principle of one person, one vote is violated by the Electoral College itself.
I remember being in 8th grade and my teacher told me the next time a president isn't elected by popular vote, somebody's going to change the system, but nobody wants to do it.
I believe strongly that in a democracy, we should respect the will of the people. And to me, that means it's time to do away with the Electoral College and move to the popular election of our presidents.
What if we'd have had Florida all over America? It would have been chaotic, and the only thing that prohibited that in an election as close even in popular vote as this one was the fact that the Electoral College essentially compartmentalized the problems.
He lost by 537 votes. I myself voted that many times for the new M&M color.
What do you think happened in Florida in the 2000 election?
Who knows? God only knows.
Since Bush's margin was down to just 1,700 votes, less than 0.5%, Florida's machine recount automatically kicked in. Lawyers and politicians on both sides called in reinforcements. And overseeing the recount was Katherine Harris, who just happened to be George W. Bush's state campaign co-chair.
43-year-old Katherine Harris.
As Secretary of State, I am Chief Elections Officer.
Republican, Bush supporter, and campaign contributor, emerging as a national figure herself in the wee hours of election night.
Secretary of State in Florida, a Republican woman by the name of Katherine Harris.
But who is she?
I'm Katherine Harris.
2 years on the job, married, mother of a teenager, multimillionaire.
With the election on the line, Harris turned to a seasoned professional. As the chief of staff for a former Republican governor, Stepanovich was known to some as Mac the Knife. A member of Jeb Bush's inner circle, he's considered one of the shrewdest strategists in Florida.
I had known Katherine a long time. I'd known her when she was in the Senate. My partners and I had helped her when she ran for Secretary of State, and so I came down to help her. And she needed it. I would arrive in the morning through the garage and come up on the elevators and come in through the cabinet office door, which is downstairs. And then in the evening when I left, I would go down the elevators and out through the garage and be driven to my car from the garage. Knowledge of my presence would have been provocative. There would have been allegations from the Democrats that I was inside cooking the numbers.
While Gore attempted to look Kennedy-esque in Washington,
We're ahead 6-0.
his legal team scrambled to prepare a court case that would buy time, more than the 7 days allowed by Florida law to recount the votes. Once a recount is initiated, certain rules apply, rules that are often open to interpretation, and no one had ever seen anything like this election. So for the next 36 days, it would be a daily tug of war, fought mostly in the courts.
The first dispute was about whether 5:00 p.m. on November 14th, 7 days after the election, was a deadline and every vote that hadn't been counted and turned in was gone or not.
The question in front of Judge Terry Lewis was whether or not to require Katherine Harris to accept hand-counted vote totals after the 7-day deadline.
The counties, Volusia and the other ones, and then Gore got into it asking me to enjoin the Secretary of State. I answered it in order and said, well, if she's got to consider it, I'm not going to tell her necessarily what she has to do. She's got to consider it. She just can't say she's not going to think about it.
We're sitting there, Judge Lewis has said, well, you can't just tell them they have to have the votes in by November 14th. You have to make a decision. You have to exercise your discretion. You have to be discreet.
A day later, she announced her decision.
I've decided it is my duty under Florida law to exercise my discretion in denying these requested amendments.
As you know, this election has been the closest in history, and the result is still in dispute.
That's right. It's in dispute because some people don't know when they got beat.
All right, the chair will record your Democratic objection to a...
We were watching Palm Beach count on television. And so we knew they weren't going to finish because we could see them not finish. And they called up and asked for an extension.
any of those four corners.
In this case, the power to deny more time for counting rested with the Secretary of State. Because the deadline for the results of the recount fell on a Sunday, when state offices were closed, the court ruled that Harris could grant a one-day extension. But the Republicans were afraid the extra day of counting votes might benefit Gore's team. So,
Well, we opened the office, called all the supervisors, told them we'd be open. And so I just read their decision and complied with what they said. Florida law was vague enough and badly written enough when examined under this kind of intense scrutiny that it was subject to some interpretation. And I doubt Gore got many calls from us.
Florida's not the only state that allows its election officials to be directly involved in political campaigns. In some states, it's been that way for at least 100 years. And some of the voting technology also goes back that far.
There are almost 200,000 polling places, and those 200,000 polling places have slightly over 700,000 voting machines that have to be stored someplace, usually right next to the snow removal equipment in the highway department.
Well, what you see here is all of these levers. These have been used since the 1890s.
Despite the age of this particular technology, there's something satisfying and certain about it.
You've got this big lever, and you pull that big lever, and it's obvious you voted. Around the other side, I just want to take one moment. There are about 250 odometers here. To reset odometers, you can stick in a credit card and reset it. Hopefully that doesn't happen by any of the administrators.
Madison County used the DataVote punch card in 2000, and it's a very good system for a small county. All the voter had to do was to make one selection on that and then punch.
I think it would be fine if voting was as fast and accurate as using an ATM machine, but again, this is a system you set up in tens of thousands of places for about 13 hours, a couple, 3 days a year.
It's expensive. It's expensive to modernize your voting machine. So you're a city councilman, and you've got a choice between a new wastewater treatment plant or a new voting machine that's used once every year, 2 years, etc. Which do you spend the money on?
In response to the problems of the national election, a handful of states enacted significant and expensive reforms. Florida was one of those. The state spent more than $30 million to reform its election system. Among the changes, new voting machines and new guidelines for improved ballot design.
With the decertification of punch cards in Florida, Madison County had to select a new voting system, and we selected an optical scan.
An optical scan machine offers the voter and the county something called second chance technology. This can prevent voters from overvoting or choosing more than one candidate for a particular office.
What happens is the voter would fill in an oval. Then the voter would take their ballot over to the tabulator. Now, if I were to overvote a ballot, it would reject it. In Florida, you're allowed 3 ballots per election. So if you overvoted, they would be issued another ballot.
New options include computer interfaces and touchscreen technology. Although again, Florida's 2002 primary proved that the newest technology doesn't solve anything if the voters and the poll workers can't figure out how to use it.
Online advocates say that the delays and confusion over ballot counting wouldn't be a problem if people voted on the internet. Oh, that's a great idea. Sure, they can't handle punch cards, but old people love the internet. My grandfather's afraid of his answering machine. Yes, I can hear you.
November 22nd, 2 weeks of round-the-clock reporting on the election story. Miami-Dade County officials were trying to recount the votes inside the Government Center building.
Now, normally, if you want to stop a vote recount, what I got to do is bring a few of my people down from up north. However, due to technical reasons, my guys can't cross state lines right now, so we had to call in the rent-a-mob from D.C.
The downstairs lobby was filling with angry Republican protesters, and there's me.
Both sides mobilized reinforcements.
They didn't dress like local people.
Some of these outraged citizens turned out to be employees of Republican House members, flown down to Florida from their offices in Washington.
Next thing I know, this crowd is closing around us, yelling, "He stole a ballot! He stole a ballot! Get him!" And I decided that the best thing for me to do was to move from that location.
Upstairs, on the 8th floor, the Miami-Dade Canvassing Board suddenly voted to stop the recount. It's unclear whether their decision was in response to all the trouble downstairs.
We're not going to do that procedure. It can't work. There's a lot of opposition to that. Okay, well, if we can't do that, we probably can't finish in time. I move to cancel the recount. Second, all in favor. And they were out of there.
Well, Stephen, clearly a completely different mood here among Republicans who feel they have won here.
Katherine Harris moved to certify the vote, while Gore appealed to the Florida Supreme Court.
The certified result in the presidential race in Florida is as follows. Governor George W. Bush, 2,912,790. Vice President Al Gore, 2,912,253.
In every instance, I believe that Katherine Harris did not only what the law allowed her to do, but in most cases did what the law required her to do, and I think she exercised the appropriate judgment in doing it.
I do not know Secretary Harris, so I don't think I'm really in a position to say what I think her motivations were. I think that every decision she made had the predictable and substantial effect of advancing the President Bush and the Republican Party's position.
I wanted, as I said before, the vote to be fair. I wanted it to be certain, and I didn't want there to be, although it was unavoidable in this circumstance, a large number of Americans who thought that they'd been cheated out of a just outcome in the election. I don't see how that result can be avoided if you let elected partisan officials hold ballots up to lights and guess what your intent was. I mean, what could be more designed to make somebody feel that the election was stolen?
Well, let me say, once the mishap happened in Florida, the right thing to do was to admit that mistakes had been made, declare the election results inconclusive, and then, of course, just let the current president have 4 more years.
I was sitting over in the war room, and people had already packed, for the most part. Along the wall, there were, bags and stuff, and guys had gathered up them. People were gathering their papers up and so forth, because there was a general feeling that that the Gore camp is just about to concede. 5 minutes before the Florida Supreme Court entered its Friday night order, we got word of it.
By a vote of 4-3, the majority of the court has reversed the decision of the trial court in part. It has further ordered that the Circuit Court of the Second Judicial Circuit here in Tallahassee shall immediately begin a manual recount.
Everybody was flabbergasted. And everybody was sort of like, wow, I just can't believe this. We were getting ready to leave.
And then, just when everyone thought it was over, the Florida Supreme Court considered whether all the unread votes throughout the state had to be manually counted.
I'm going to have them start. And they told me, well, it looks like it's probably going to you. I believe the facility will be
The job of overseeing the entire recount fell to Judge Terry Lewis. Volunteers and judges were sworn in around the state to make what was supposed to be a quick, thorough, and final hand count of all the unread ballots.
She's going to get this one. Do you need that? Well, let her look at it while you think.
It's slightly detached.
We really didn't have any idea
even what these cards were going to look like. And of course, we'd heard all the same reports in the media and the characterizations of the hanging chads and pregnant chads. And I thought, well, this is really going to be a difficult task.
When you actually started looking at those ballots, it was not difficult.
And each precinct, and Charlie and I would alternate, we'd pick up the individual ballot, look at it. Charlie would announce whether he thought it was a vote for Bush, Gore, or a no vote.
Determining the intent of the voter was at the heart of the state Supreme Court's decision to call for a recount. But just how a voter's intent should be measured was left somewhat vague.
So it would seem like an overvote is the same thing as a no vote. The machine didn't count it.
In this election, votes that would normally have been discarded became critical, and Judge Lewis was inclined to count overvotes where there was no doubt what the voter intended. For example, if you checked the name of the candidate and then wrote the same candidate's name on the bottom of the ballot, your intent was very clear.
Whether it be 1 vote, 2 votes, or 20 votes, obviously 2 other people sitting there might have had different opinions on some of those ballots.
But I really doubt it. Because I think Charlie and I are quite different people, and I thought, well, perhaps we're going to disagree on a lot of these, but we didn't.
Look, all this obsession over voter intent it gets in the way of the due process of law. It turns this whole election into nothing more than a popularity contest.
With an overwhelming Republican majority under Governor Jeb Bush, Florida's legislature went into special session today.
The state legislature had a backup plan. They would invoke a law that would allow them to handpick electors who'd support Bush regardless of the recount.
The Florida legislature had the right to do so. The power to determine how electors to the Electoral College from a given state are selected resides in the state legislature. The state legislature can say it will be by a popular vote, but the state legislature can also take that right back.
That was ordered by Judge Lewis. Hang on one second, David. They're interrupting me now. Bob Franken at the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington has a bit of news.
Very big news. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to put a stay on the recount in Florida.
We have to stop, even in the middle of the machines.
Yes. We're extremely gratified that the United States Supreme Court has once again recognized or seen what we think are some very serious deficiencies in the way the process has been conducted.
3 days later, on December 12th, at about 10 p.m., the United States Supreme Court issued its momentous ruling.
Here they come! Here they come!
God.
Oh, Charles Bibber!
Bernie, let's work through this as carefully as we can, but let me get to the bottom line here. The judgment of the Supreme Court of Florida is reversed. That was the judgment that had allowed these broad counts to go forward.
The court's majority opinion held that Florida's citizens would be denied equal protection had the recounts proceeded, because ballots conceivably could be interpreted differently in different parts of the state.
When they said equal protection, I thought, equal protection, how can that possibly be a problem? It never has been an election. And if equal protection is a problem, the whole election ought to be thrown out.
We're going to go to the Supreme Court and Steve Carell. Steve.
Yeah, okay.
Steve Carell.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. That's good. That's
yeah, Steve, what can you tell...
Okay, just a second, John.
What can you tell us about...
Wait a sec, John. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like the General Gao's chicken. Not too spicy.
We still don't know.
The decision went on to say that voter intent was too broad a concept for legal certainty. But like just about everything else in Election 2000, that argument would be subject to debate as well, because broad and abstract concepts are at the cornerstone of the American justice system.
Every day in this country, we have jurors convict people of serious crimes based on a definition of reasonable doubt. You're in a jury and you say, you must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And the jury instruction, which I could probably quote for you, but I'm not going to, is not very clear. And the fact that you might get something different, the fact that Broward County, for example, may do it different than Leon County, should make a bit of difference because jurors do that differently across the state and across the country anyway.
And all of a sudden to decide this in the Supreme Court of the United States, as they did,
I thought, and of course other justices in the minority shared this view, that it was a dark day for the court.
Our Constitution says the final arbiter is the United States Supreme Court. Whether you agreed or disagree with it, you have to respect that decision. I think it was probably a good thing to end it.
I don't have an opinion on Bush v. Gore, but I will say that the Bush White House and Republicans in the House and the Senate have been careful not to talk too much about Bush v. Gore because talk about it undermines the presidency.
I think it was an absolute disaster. If not, it just shows that it was fixed.
I thought the Supreme Court really did a cheap thing and compromised that election.
Well, you know, when you lose, it's just hard. When you lose by less than 1/2 of 1%, for the rest of your life you wake up and thinking, what could have been different? Anything could have made a difference. I could have called my mama and she could have gotten 3 friends and we'd have won that election. And so you just look for every little thing because life's not fair and you were robbed. Well, all of those things just aren't true. They lost. Get over it.
I might be inclined to accept the notion that I was just being a sore loser if it weren't for one troubling fact. I won. How can you be a sore loser if you win? I was a sore winner.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I believe that if the United States Supreme Court had not intervened, we would have counted all the ballots and counted them properly. And it's still difficult to think as to what might have been the result if we had counted the overvotes and gone back into those 36 counties that in fact had not counted the overvotes. Those were easily discernible votes. If we had counted those votes, then Al Gore would have been elected president because he would have carried Florida.
Thank you all. Chief Justice Rehnquist, President Bush.
After the election, a number of news organizations joined forces to do what the Supreme Court had stopped, to examine the uncounted ballots.
What we found in the end, it was fascinating in that it showed that at the time of the election controversy in Florida, both campaigns did the wrong thing. The ballots that Gore asked for would not have helped him. He was hunting in the wrong forest. And the things that Bush's campaign tried so hard to keep from being counted actually would have benefited him. And the cache of ballots that could have given the election to Gore, nobody was even paying attention to. So what we found is that kind of everybody had the wrong strategy in Florida. If any of the recounts that were actively underway had been completed, it still would have been a victory for Bush. And what that is that the 4 counties that Gore asked for would not have yielded enough ballots for him to gain. Even the statewide undervote recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court would not have yielded enough ballots. We asked each county, what ballots were you going to count? What marks were you going to count? And we used exactly what they said. And that still did not give Gore enough votes to overcome Bush's lead. Only if you say count all the ballots statewide, all the undervotes and all the overvotes, then Gore comes out ahead.
The failure in Florida was bipartisan. The responsibility of Katherine Harris and her election officials to see to it that everything was done properly is clear, and they failed in their responsibility. It is also true that many of the county election officials, who are Democrats, failed in their responsibility. What we're left with is saying, these bad things happen. No matter why they happen, let's fix them.
Even if we fix all the glitches of election 2000, low voter turnout reflects a disturbingly weak commitment to our electoral process.
If only 60% of Americans are voting, even if those votes are properly counted and carefully counted, we're still dealing in a shrunken and distorted electorate that therefore doesn't fully represent the will of the public.
Well, let's look at what happened here. They call this a dark moment for the American electoral system, and I just don't think that's valid. I think it shows that it works. I know I'm proud to be part of the peaceful transition of power. I know Karen Hughes was. I know that Karl Rove is, and I'm proud of the American voters. In voter turnout, America's now climbed to number 120 out of 169 nations. We've left Mexico in our wake. We're hot on the heels of the Dominican Republic, so I think it's obvious that we've got a system that works.
Not everyone agrees. Some connect low voter turnout to the fact that two political parties produce limited political choice.
Major problem is the U.S. is that you have two parties who are not on top of each other, but the scope is pretty narrow, and it's a choice between, you know, this and then maybe this.
Two parties means only a choice. You know, it's only one more than one party. And, you know, people say things like, if the American people had a choice of only two breakfast cereals, that there would be rioting in the streets.
I don't want a field of 15 candidates, you know. I want 2 candidates or 3, because that's about as much as people can focus on.
You're not giving American people enough credit. I think a lot of people come into the election and they really look at all the candidates and where they stand on the issues, and they make a decision. And I think that more choices is definitely better.
The task is not only to go out there and vote, but to work on changing the system. If we want to have a society that treats everyone equally and that gives everybody equal rights and that says everybody's interests are as important as everybody else's interests, that is the project of democracy. And our nation is as democratic as it is because people have fought for that project for more than 200 years.
The project of democracy is an ongoing one, and we have learned some lessons from all the accidents and incidents of Election 2000. For 2 years, the U.S. Congress grappled with election reforms, finally writing legislation that, among other things, provides money for new technology and training, and even for provisional balloting. A few states have enacted significant reform, Maryland and Georgia among them. Florida provided more than $30 million before primary day 2002. But in most states, it's still election business as usual. And as we've seen, in Florida, new technology brought some new problems. So it's just a start. If we're serious about being the world's greatest democracy, then our reforms must reinforce a system that encourages participation, assures fairness, and makes it clear that we all have a voice and a stake. We'll be judged by the results, and with 2000 still fresh in our minds, by the answer to this question. In the next really close election, could it all happen again?
We cannot, as a country, talk about democracy, but don't walk the walk. When my colleagues get on the floor and talk about so-and-so, this dictator had an election and this, that, and the other, I go on the floor and say, we have no room to talk until we fix the problems here in the United States.
I wish I would have won, but we're in, really okay hands. You got George W., Dick Cheney, and Colin Powell. Kind of reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Colin Powell has courage, and now if we could get that one other guy brain and that other guy heart, we're going to be set. Okay, cut. That it? Oh, man. As you've seen tonight, what happened in Florida is definitely a tragedy and a travesty to democracy. But, think about this. Who did it hurt? Al Gore? Easy. Just pull it off. Al Gore, the American people, the democratic process, it hurt them, sure. But let's not forget the one who suffers the most. The man who wears this hair and this nose. Darrell Hammond. Do you know how hard I worked on an Al Gore impression? It's the hardest impression I've ever had to do. I studied hundreds of hours of tape. Hundreds. And I finally got it. And I can't get rid of it now. I'm constantly finding myself say things like, would you supersize that? Or, what toy comes in a Happy Meal? Or, can I have fries with that? Al Gore thinks he got robbed. stand in line, buddy, because the real victim is right here. I know being the president is a big deal, but trust me, wearing this putty nose and this fake horsehair and making fun of a president is the biggest responsibility in America. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Who Counts may be ordered for educational use by calling 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
Those days of arguing about who had won the presidency heightened a political interest in this country that we had not seen for years. I think the speech I'll give now about how your vote counts, I'm not going to have to point back to some 19th century example. I can point to an example that every young person, at least for this generation, will be able to recall.
So how do you deal with losing?
I find it useful to take all those feelings and compress them into a dense black ball of pain and resentment, which I then keep in what I call my emotional lockbox. Could this happen again? Could what happen again?
This is a production of Issues TV, which is solely responsible for its content. This program was made possible with support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support was provided by the following: